I think we can start. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for this invitation. It's a great pleasure for me to be with you today to discuss these topics with a very distinguished panel of experts, practitioners, and representatives from also different member states. So it's an honor for me. We have, unfortunately, for bureaucratic issues, one panelist missing, but we are glad that he could join virtually today. My name is Daniele Fettibene. I'm the coordinator of the European Think Tanks Group, ETTG. We are a network of 6 think tanks in Europe from different member states, Germany, France, UK, Italy, Belgium/Netherlands, and Spain. We are gathering more than 400 researchers dealing with Africa and development cooperation in Europe, independent think tanks. And we're very glad to be with you today, representing the network, and also hearing new voices in the Europe-Africa dialogue that we know it's very much influenced by traditional voices, so it's good that the experience of the Baltics are taken into account when we discuss about these topics, because in these very contested times, they can be, very significantly driving the debate, both internally within the EU and externally with our partners. Let me first introduce our panelists today. I will start with Ambassador Arnoldas Pranckevičius, Ambassador of Lithuania to the EU. It will be leaving shortly because he has some meetings today, but we have also a new panelist who will replace him. We are also glad for you that you took the time for being with us today. We have Mr. Serhii Tereshko, Deputy Head of the Mission of Ukraine to the European Union. Mr. Nicola Bellomo, Head of Division of Pan-African Affairs in the European External Action Service. Dr. Hassan Khannenje, who is joining virtually, and he is Director of the Horn International Institute for Strategic Studies. And last but not least, Dr. Patryk Labuda, who is a fellow from the University of Zurich. So let me start by giving the floor to all our panelists, and I will start with Ambassador Pranckevičius. We discussed this before, and I think this is something we should elaborate more now, that the Baltic states are a very good example of democratic transition in the European Union. Lithuania is one of the most important examples of this, and it can serve as a democracy hub also for African countries. So what is your opinion about the role that Lithuania and the Baltic states can play in helping and in creating a dialogue with African countries in, building this transition towards democracy in a context in which the Russian aggression of Ukraine is, putting a challenge to democratic values, not only within the EU, but also externally. So I will give you the floor. We'll just remind you the rules of the game. We have 5-7 minutes each to reply to the questions. I will try to be as strict as possible, but the floor is yours.
Thank you, Daniele, and great pleasure to be at this very, indeed, important conference and to be with you this morning. Your question, I think, is a very interesting one, because indeed for us as the Baltic states, the relationship with African countries is something which I would say is still untapped potential. We are very much trying to expand our diplomatic and economic presence in the continent and find the ways where we can cooperate. And here also, for instance, I would like to mention Africo, one of the NGOs which is organizing this conference, and its flagship program, Digital Explorers, bringing the ICT specialists specifically from Nigeria, but probably not only, to Lithuania for, to the IT companies for training, professional experience, and building those relationships also in the high technology field, which is a very good example that we shouldn't be in this relationship of only giving and taking, or recipient and donor, but rather an equal type of relationship where we can learn from each other. And here I think the Baltic states, as you've mentioned, have an interesting story to tell, a story of freedom, a story of successful transformation, a story of course of oppression, of multiple occupations, from Tsarist to Nazi to Soviet, and a story of people who have resisted those occupations and the totalitarian regimes. And the only 3 former Soviet Union republics that have made the whole journey, the full journey, to the fully fledged democratic systems and free market economies and full members of the European Union and NATO. By itself, sometimes also in Lithuania, we treat it today as a miracle, and we're very grateful also to fate and to the big determination of our previous governments and the populations and of the European Union to have made it a success. But now, today, we have a historical obligation vis-à-vis the people of Ukraine, specifically to help them in their quest, not only for freedom, but I would say for survival, when they are attacked so fundamentally by Russia, which has invaded the country and has undermined the critical and most important principles of the United Nations Charter of territorial integrity and sovereignty, and that is committing every day the war crimes and undermining the international law and international conventions. So I think in this situation, we have an opportunity, not only a challenge, but a great opportunity to find common ground with our partners in Africa, to be much more convincing also in our strategic communication. And of course, I'm sure my colleague from the ES will be talking about that, because High Representative Vice President Borrell is often discussing the problem of the battle of narratives and the place which European Union is playing in that regard. We should be very open about the facts, especially vis-à-vis the growing food and energy security crisis, where we saw also it playing out very vividly last week in the United Nations General Assembly, where many leaders addressed that question, and where quite clearly also the Western leaders were showing the data and the examples how with our common efforts we've been helping to alleviate those problems through the solidarity lanes, through the, of course, the agreement with Ukraine, mediated also by the United Nations and Turkey, to get the grain out of the Odessa port and other Ukrainian ports to the world. And 2/3 of that grain is going to, in fact, the less developed countries. So this is an opportunity for us to be together, especially in defense of human rights, in defense of democracy, in defense of fundamental, in many ways, principles of human dignity and sovereign choices of countries to exist. This is fundamental. It's not about the choice between the West or the East, between the South or the North. It is the choice between, respecting international law, respecting United Nations Charter or not. And I think there, I'm quite confident we're all have the answer on both continents where we stand, and that this type of behavior, which we've seen and we're seeing every single day in Ukraine, is unacceptable and can be very dangerous for any country in the future if this world of international law and norms and rules is broken into such a fundamental way. So I think, we as the Baltic states, we have a small story, but a convincing story to tell, and we're very much ready to play a very active role in this conversation.
Thank you so much, Ambassador, and I agree that you do have a convincing story to tell, and in a context where the mutual trust between Europe and Africa is under challenge, especially from the African side, for ambitions that maybe were not met, or promises which were not kept. These concrete examples are important for them. And now I would like to give the floor to Mr. Tereshko. We know that in the past weeks, President Zelensky has also started to engage with several African partners to create a dialogue and a platform to discuss also for the restoration of the country. What do you think could be the role of the European Union and also Central East European countries? What role could they play in this dialogue between Ukraine and African leaders to discuss short-term but also medium and long-term perspectives of cooperation?
Good morning. First of all, thank you for having me here. My apologies that Ambassador couldn't make it being here, and the reason, in fact, very much related to the issue of today's discussion. Today there is a Agri-Fish EU Council meeting, and our Ukrainian Minister for Agriculture and Food is here in Brussels to participate in this EU Council meeting, probably to a significant extent to discuss the global food crisis and Ukraine's and EU joint efforts in this regard, how to solve this problem, which affects Africa probably the most. Later on, there will be also today Transport Committee meeting of the European Parliament, again with participation of Ukrainian Ministry of Infrastructure, discussing the ways how efficient or not the solidarity lanes and grain initiatives are operating. And this is just two examples of today to show to which extent food crisis and Africa aspect influences, in fact, Ukraine-EU agenda as well. And yes, you're perfectly right mentioning that Ukrainian leadership, starting from the President of Ukraine and in fact continuing with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, is increasing the attention to the Africa. I can disclose you the nearest plan of our Minister for Foreign Affairs that he is planning probably the first for decades tourney to Africa in coming weeks, I believe, or days, visiting probably the countries which Ukrainian high authorities never visited before. So it will be physical visit for extensive number of countries. So, and the reason here probably indeed that any existential crisis, as Ambassador Pranckevičius described, is also an opportunity to think what we didn't not proper enough before, and in this context, I believe it can be referred both to the EU probably and to Ukraine for sure, that we didn't pay necessary attention to the African cause, and we are going to resolve this issue very actively. President of Ukraine has reached out number of African leaders. He spoke to African Union and conveying the messages, what are the reasons of the current crisis in the world, and in fact we are facing, we in response we understand that there is an understanding. What we lacked, probably the lack of communication. We had to talk more to Africa, and here I believe we have to combine our efforts with the European Union in arranging these lines of good communication, because, well, results are the current situation, for instance, in the UN is quite unfortunately to us outspoken, that many African countries still follow the Russian ratio about the reasons of the crisis, and even their voting outcomes shows that to a significant extent they are either abstaining or not voting, even with some example of voice voting in favor of Russia. So we really wish to solve this miscommunication, or lack of communication, better to say, between Africa and Europe, being part of Europe in most effective way. And your precise question, how particularly Ukraine or Africa or Central Eastern Europe can be helpful, probably also it should be a lesson for us that it happens so that African policy of the EU. Sorry that I'm assessing the EU-African policy, but was led mostly not by Central Eastern Europe but some other member states having great experience in Africa relations. So probably we have to bring fresh air, fresh attitude, fresh approach to this communication between Europe, and I'm specifically calling Europe, not EU. Having Ukraine in mind as well, in arranging these lines of communication with Africa. We are ready as Ukraine to provide our experience as well, and as Ukraine, in fact, had good experience in providing experts to Africa in exploration, African economies, African resources, working there on the ground. So we have good specialists knowing some particular countries with their potential economic capabilities. Ukraine has excellent experience and knowledge in teaching students from Africa. We have enormous amount of students which wish to study from Africa, to study in Ukraine, and in fact many of them were faced the war of Russia in Ukraine personally. Their work has come when they were in Ukraine, so their studying has interrupted, but we hope that it will be resumed, and we also ready to suggest to the European Union our experience and expertise. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Tereshko. And I think this issue of the cultural links and the education is fundamental, and not stopping these flows is extremely important, because it creates this informal dialogue and also exchange of younger generations on topics, and maybe it can also influence political decisions. I will now turn to Mr. Bellomo. We know that the Russian aggression occurred 1 week after the EU summit, long-awaited summit with a lot of expectations from both sides, and also a lot of frustrations for the delay. And we know that during the summit there were a lot of ambitious targets proposed by both sides. And in the meantime, the US launched very ambitious plans like the Global Gateway, and the war in Ukraine occurred in a moment where it seemed that this trust was starting to a little bit recovering, and then it changed the plans. So my question to you is, how is the Russian aggression to Ukraine changing the topics, the priorities on which the European External Action Service is working on Africa? And do you see a change in this policy agenda, and how you try to combine the traditional plans that you had with the new geopolitical and geoeconomic context in which you are operating?
Thank you very much, and allow me at the very outset to thank Africo, Friends of Europe, and the Africa-Europe Foundation for hosting this event, which provides a good opportunity to exchange and discuss on these very topical issues. And allow me also to frame this discussion in what is, without any ambiguity, the European Union considers this an illegal, unjustified aggression. And as Ursula von der Leyen, President of the European Commission, mentioned only a few days ago in the State of the Union address, we do consider this aggression not only aggression to Ukraine, but an aggression, as the ambassador mentioned, to our economy, to our values, and to our future. And in this respect, there is also no ambiguity that support to Ukraine is part of this broader solution. And again, the European Union is fully committed to support Ukraine in this framework. So some observers and the UN Secretary General mentioned we are in kind of a perfect storm, which is a combination of different crises, some of them not necessarily started with the aggression of Russia to Ukraine, like food security, which was mentioned. Food security is emerging as probably the most critical aspect of this crisis when it comes to Africa and the impact on African economies and the impact on the development path of African countries. So when you ask me to what extent these crises will impact, I can tell you that we can hardly see our relations with Africa only through the lenses of the Russian aggression. This Russian aggression has had an impact on the global landscape, not only on the Europe-Africa relation. So we have to frame these into the broader context and address these. And I can tell you that when it comes to the food security, for instance, and this also allows me, and I regret, I have a lot of respect for Professor Carlos Lopez. I witnessed his, let's say, strong commitment in my last 20 years I spent in Africa. I'm new, I moved to Brussels only 2 weeks ago. So this being said, you know, I can hardly understand diminishing or let's say downgrading Global Gateway, for instance, to something which is there just to label, to match or to mirror what Chinese are doing. Here we're talking about a very ambitious development plan. And again, what I can hardly understand is this persistent and dominant narrative about a European Union patronizing or pointing fingers, which I can tell you in my experience on the ground over the last 20 years, it's an issue of the past. I mean, what's happening these days and what's it shaping our EU-Africa relation is based really on a very integrated approach. We build our priorities and we align our priorities 100% with the local development agendas, priorities, and plans. So we try to support the vision and the ambitions of our partner countries at bilateral, regional, and continental level. So I really would challenge anyone to give me an example, not just in theory, but an example where these projected European Union patronizing approach is taking place these days, because I can hardly mention any. So to go back to our relations, as I mentioned, especially as a result of the summit in February, we are shaping a very ambitious agenda and very much focused on tangible, operational, and transformational objectives. So again, when it comes to food security, our main objectives these days in Africa, and again, both at bilateral and regional continental level, is to support our partner countries in transforming their agriculture sector. So to move away from traditional subsistence agriculture to a more market-oriented, export-oriented introduction of high-value crops, so introduction of new technologies, so a lot of transfer of capacity, etc. So this is also very much important to be framed within the implementation of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, which was mentioned earlier this morning, which in my opinion can be a real game changer when it comes to the both intra-African trade, but also in relation to our relation with the European Union, between European Union and Africa. And I really welcome this renewed engagement for the Baltic countries, because I think European Union really can be a model of integration. So when it comes to the implementation of the internal market, when it comes to promotion of values, I think that we all, and regardless of the size of the country, we have our voice. The fact that you don't have probably your flag linked to specific activities does not mean you are not present. I mean, I was very proudly representing the European Union in different countries. My last one was in Rwanda until a couple of weeks ago, where I was proudly representing the whole European Union, and not only the few countries, very few that have an embassy in Rwanda. So I think we should also move away from this notion and also try to promote a better integration in what we call the Team Europe approach. Team Europe is becoming really is not just a buzzword, it's really a reality on the ground, where we try to maximize and produce cross-fertilization among what we as European Union can do, our member states, our financial institutions, namely the European Investment Bank, and also to take on board the private sector. This is also what is worth, I think, mentioning in terms of a new feature of this Africa-EU partnership. And that's where I think we all have a role to play. So I also witness myself a number of companies from Baltic countries exploring, scouting, and coming to also mapping. As the ambassador mentioned, I think it's very important to map these opportunities, because we are still, and especially these days with this Russian crisis, these perceptions can really shape, you know, a different understanding of the opportunities between Europe and Africa. So I think it's very important to debunk, and later I think we will discuss about these battles of narratives. So I will wait, but I think this is a clear element. As Ambassador mentioned, the High Representative Josep Borrell is really emphasizing this element, but I think we'll come back later to this point. Thank you.
No, but thanks a lot for mentioning this issue of the narratives and perceptions, because this is actually what I wanted to ask now to Mr. Khannenje. We know, you remember very well, and we all remember very well, end of February when the voting at UN General Assembly took place, that Europeans were shocked when they saw that there was not a common perception and common agreement on the aggression of Russia of Ukraine. So my question is, I'm coming back very recently from Zimbabwe and Botswana, and even there you see that the debate that we have in Europe is very much different, of course, in countries which have been hit very hard from COVID and they're still recovering, and now are hit by you know, the consequences of the war in Ukraine for food security, debt. So my question to you is, what is the perception of what is going on in Ukraine, in Africa, in your country, and how do you think we Europeans should even change our narratives when we come into dialogue with African countries on these particular topics? You are muted, I think.
Yes, you can hear me now.
Yes, perfectly.
Yeah, thank you very much, and you know, for organizers for putting this together. I think it's a timely discussion. Was unable to travel to Brussels, but hopefully next time I should be able to make it in case we have such an event. Yeah. Now, question is actually very good. Now, while especially our Western and European partners were shocked at Africa's reaction, on the other hand, Africans were shocked, but actually our European and Western partners were shocked at Africa's reaction. And the reason, you know, comes from a number of things. When you, the Kenya's ambassador to the United Nations gave a very eloquent, you know, take and a speech, of course, that castigated Russia's actions in Ukraine, alluding to a number of historical as well as practical things with regard to international law. That, of course, you know, Russia had violated. However, if you listen to the last part of his speech, and Ambassador Kimani is a man I know, he's a good friend of mine, he mentioned a number of aspects that actually explains in large part Africa's ambivalence, especially towards the conflict. And that is, he mentioned the recent, the trend in the recent past of the big powers breaching international law. And he mentioned the trend in the recent past of the big powers. And he mentioned specifically that including members of the Security Council violating territorial integrity, but, you know, pretty much getting what they want and disobeying, or at least with, you know, in total disregard to multilateralism, which of course was trying to front. And so the last part of his speech was actually more explanatory when it comes to Africa's attitudes towards the conflict. Now, how do Africans see this? I would like slightly to disagree with the last speaker on the concept that there is no sense of you know, patronizing of the continent. And I'm speaking as someone who understands this continent fairly well. Perhaps it's not exactly, you know, towards Europe, but generally towards the West, especially insofar as dealing with Africa is concerned. And if you're paying special attention recently, South Africa's Minister for Foreign Affairs, the kind of speech and remarks she made during the visit by the United States Secretary of State Blinken, I think it encapsulates a lot of thinking on the African continent, from Cairo to the Cape of Good Hope. That is across the continent. And this thing, of course, is informed by a number of dynamics that have taken place in the recent past. And that has to do with the sense, number one, that Africa lacks agency when it comes to global geopolitics or things that matter. Second, that whenever it comes to a crisis outside the continent, especially in Europe, Africa is completely forgotten. And Africans have been pointing to a number of crises that are going on the continent right now, not just in food security, but the continent, the crisis in Ethiopia, the conflict and terrorism, in the Sahel region, the instabilities in the DRC, going all the way down, of course, to Cabo Delgado in Mozambique, as important conflicts and issues that perhaps the world should have paid attention to that it's not paying attention to right now. And so this one compounded with the fact that in the Cold War era, one thing that happened that was fundamental, especially in the African psyche, is that as the West, especially the richer powers in the West, focused more on reconstructing Eastern Europe, Africa was all but abandoned. And that sense, it is actually deep inside. Now, these are not issues or ideas that are shared generally in polite company. And that is why perhaps sometimes our colleague might not have exactly been able to get it from some scholars or politicians of the continent. But it's something, if you are to organize a town hall of university graduates or even people just on the streets, they're going to be able to communicate the truth. And that is what informs this kind of challenge. Now, without perhaps going too much into details, how do they see the conflict right now? The conflict is seen as from a geopolitical standpoint. Number one, as a unresolved Cold War, issue between especially NATO and what remained of Soviet Union, which is now Russia, at least a big part of this, what was Soviet Union, which is Russia, and it's seen from the prism of contestations between the East and the West, generally, in part also because of what has been happening on the continent. One thing that the continent has witnessed is the West re-engagement on the continent has been more in response, for instance, to Chinese and Russia's actions, as opposed to inherent long-term policy calculations and recalibrations that are actually going to strengthen the kind of engagement that is needed. Now, for those of us, for instance, who believe in more freer societies, more open societies, and more democratic societies, we are almost right now in a corner, in part because the relative success of perceived authoritarianism, but also the relative abandonment of, especially of the ideas of democracy in terms of especially robust support from the West, has led to the declining democracy on the continent. And in part because there's so much focus on other issues that the continent has become not only an afterthought, but it's actually something that's become a footnote. There is another critical aspect which I would like to bring to attention that perhaps sometimes our colleagues and partners in the West do not understand. And that, of course, then also explains to the sense of patronizing attitude that sometimes Africans have. Africans, by and large, blame the West generally for having destroyed Libya. And the destruction of Libya, or the collapse of Libya, set into motion a series of events that destabilized the entire Sahel and much of Horn of Africa. Some of us who deal in especially security issues, we can trace a lot of things with regard to the impact of the collapse of Libya and how that has destabilized much of Africa and increased the problem of terrorism. In fact, 5 or 6 attempted coups in West Africa and the Horn, for instance, in the last 24 months are directly attributed to the clamor for security that the governments in those countries are actually not providing as a result of the growth of terrorist and militant groups. And so these are issues that sometimes are not exactly discussed by our partners or understood. And yet, when the Libya collapsed, for instance, the West absolutely withdrew, at least that's how Africans look at it. And then they abandoned and left Africa to fend for itself. Now, that is complicated by the recent conflict in Ukraine, in which, for instance, when the sanctions were rightly and justifiably imposed on Russia for its blatant violation of international law and human rights, Africa was never consulted with the extent to which it's going to be affected or how, for instance, the world was going to plug in for that shortfall. In some countries on the continent and in the Horn, they rely as much as 40 or even 60% of their wheat imports from that conflict area. Of course, they are going to suffer immensely. Yet, this is the continent that is also suffering a lot from the effects of climate change as well as perpetual drought. The Horn of Africa and Kenya, for instance, they've seen the worst drought in 40 years. But these are issues that are not exactly addressed, nor were they ever considered. So the rise in energy prices, the rise in food prices and commodity prices and cement as well as others is literally preventing this ability of these countries to be able to recover from the post-COVID, or rather post-act. And so a number of these factors have conspired to make the conflict in Ukraine not only remote, but as something to Africans that the West, for instance, is using to try and get the attention of the continent at the time, of course, when they need the continent. But a lot of times, whenever it comes to critical issues that affect the continent, they are normally an afterthought. And so I think we have to discuss honestly and frankly, especially for those of us who share common ideas when it comes to international law, human rights, and democracy, if we actually have to have a common approach. I think my minute is up, and so I would like to put it back to the moderator.
Thank you so much. Very important points, and the issue of the ambiguity of European partners on human rights and international law is on the table and should always be reminded, because we should never take it for granted when then we address African countries on specific topics dealing with governance, on security, etc. So I would like to turn now the floor to Patryk, Dr. Patryk Labuda. The last speaker rightly mentioned the fact that there is the need for a more nuanced dialogue between Africa, Europe. What topics do you think are most relevant in this change of narratives and change of discussions that should be brought to the table, and how the experience of Central East European intellectual can play a role in this? Because we know that the transition was not only a political, economic transition, but also a cultural one. And the experience of the Baltics and the Central and East European countries is extremely relevant on this side. So how do you think your experience could bring more nuances in the dialogue between Europe and Africa on issues like international law, human rights, but also human and economic development?
All right. Well, thank you very much, and thank you for the previous intervention, because I think it sets the stage nicely for what I'm going to say. I mean, I come at this as an academic, as an intellectual, not a policymaker, not a diplomat. So I'm afraid I may be a little more long-winded in my remarks, a little less diplomatic also. I mean, thank you also for the opportunity. It's really great to be here. I am representing Eastern Europe, whatever that means. I'm not from a Baltic state. I happen to be from Poland, and I live in Senegal. So I've been observing, the evolution in Africa's response. To use again a very general term, Africa. What is Africa? But just observing how African states are responding to the war in Ukraine, and I want to share my thoughts. What I've observed and what I think about this as somebody who comes from Eastern Europe. So, the first thing to emphasize really, and this is going off what the previous panelist said, Africa's response, I think, is complex. We need to try and understand it in its complexity and its nuances. This is not a simple case of Africa responding with one voice, right? So I think it's important always to really be humble in approaching these issues. And I think, the previous speaker has given us a lot to think about already. That being said, I'm going to now turn to narratives, general narratives that emerged. after this war restarted. And so I'm going to generalize a little bit, and of course, not all African states have the same view, not all Africans feel the same way, but I feel that these narratives are pretty dominant, common, not just in Africa, but also in Europe. So a common narrative, I think, is that this is a war between the West and Russia, between NATO and Russia, Europe and Russia, that this is somehow a conflict that has pitted the global North versus the global South. And what's really interesting about this, of course, is that this is the narrative that Russia has been selling, right? And it's a narrative that's become very dominant, not just in Africa, but also in Europe. When people talk about this war, oftentimes here in Europe, we also adopt these frames. And so I want to complexify this a little bit, coming from Eastern Europe, from Poland, and get us thinking about a few things to sort of maybe challenge this narrative. I mean, the first thing to say about this is that it really denies the agency of the Ukrainians in this war. And we just heard a thing or two about the agency of Africa, right? But let's be clear about this. We are denying the agency of Ukraine in this war when we talk about it as a conflict between the West and Russia, NATO and Russia. The Ukrainians have been very clear about this, right? They've said, we do not want to be colonized by Russia again, right? It's very simple. Our old colonial master is not coming back. And I think we need to pay attention to what the Ukrainians are saying. The other thing about this that I think is really interesting is that the narratives get everything completely wrong. I mean, it's literally upside down if you think about this. The reason we have this war is because Ukraine is not a part of the West. It is not a part of the European Union. If you think about it, I'm not really sure that it is a part of the global North. Just think about it. If Ukraine were a part of NATO, were a part of the European Union, would Russia have attacked? I'm really not so sure. The problem here is that Ukraine occupies, in my opinion, really an ill-defined space in between. It's a post-colonial state, a weak state. If you look at the Human Development Index, it's at 77. It's below many so-called Global South countries. Go to the Human Development Index, you'll see many countries from Latin America that are above Ukraine, many countries from Asia that are above Ukraine, and that's before the war. Now that the war has, taken its toll, Ukraine is going to be well below various Global South countries. The problem here is that Ukraine is somewhere in between. It doesn't really fit. The point I'm trying to make is that we all have our mental maps about the world, Europe, East, West, NATO, Russia, the global North, global South, but Ukraine, it doesn't really map on to these maps very well. I mean, if you think about it a little harder, Ukraine occupies a really ill-defined space. Now, the question that I ask myself, if you accept what I'm saying, because of course, you can challenge whether this is an accurate portrayal, but the question that I ask myself is, why do these narratives hold? Why can't we complexify the conversation? Why are we not having a more complex debate about Ukraine and this war, right? And here, I guess the point that I'm going to make, and this is a point that's directed not just at Africa, it's directed at Europe. We need to take more seriously the voices of Eastern Europeans, so people from the region, Ukrainians in particular, but people from the region who have experienced Russian imperialism, Russian colonialism. And, it's really interesting that when you hear people talking about this war, oftentimes the experts are from Western Europe. And that goes for the European External Action Service, right, where I used to work for a few years. The people who actually go and engage with Africans trying to explain this conflict, where are they from? From Italy, Germany, France? They're all from Western Europe, people who don't really have legitimacy to talk about colonialism, imperialism in Africa. And I think it's a missed opportunity. The European Union needs to do a better job of integrating Eastern Europeans. You know, my country, Poland, I know that it's not really contributing to the European project right now. So we can be self-critical about this, right? But I think the European Union can also be more critical about it, about its policies. In Africa, same thing. It's really interesting because, you know, I follow Al Jazeera, Africa News. I watch that more than I do CNN. When Ukrainians feature on the news, it's in the role of the victim. It's the victim, the emotional victim who, you know, the war is affecting us. But when you have experts, you have local experts from the Middle East, from Africa, which is great. But then when you have a foreign expert, they happen to be from Western Europe, the United States, the United Kingdom. Very rarely do you have people from the Baltics, from Eastern Europe, from Ukraine. Again, in my opinion, a missed opportunity. And it is, of course, ironic that this would happen on Al Jazeera, where, you know, Africans oftentimes complain about the lack of agency, the fact that African positions are not taken seriously. I'm not sure that Ukrainian positions are being taken very seriously always in these conversations either. In conclusion, why do I think all this matters? Just very briefly, because I know I've already exceeded my time. But, you know, I don't think this is a question of just us being inclusive for the sake of us being inclusive, right? Representation for the sake of representation. It's not just about having people from the region speak about these issues because, you know, it's important to include local voices, although that is very important. I think it's also that this would really nuance the debate, you know, and I'll just say one word about the prohibition on the use of force. I'm an international lawyer, so I come at this from that angle. I think to generate understanding, greater understanding about what is at stake when it comes to the violation of the prohibition of the use of force, Article 2.4 in the UN Charter, the fact that we do not want to return to the 19th century. We do not want territorial conquest. That is not a world that we want to live in. And I think, you know, if we have these conversations that are more inclusive, that include the views of people who until very recently lived under Russian occupation, I think that would generate greater understanding of what is at stake in this war. We do not want to return to the 19th century where the great powers partitioned Africa, where the great powers partitioned Eastern Europe, right? So I think a lot is at stake here, and, you know, I guess just ending this, I would say that it is a plea for more dialogue between Europe and Africa. But when I say Europe, I don't just mean Western Europe, I do mean Eastern Europe, the Baltic states, and of course, Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you, Patryk. I subscribe 100% to this, and I think this lack of expertise in the key institutions that are dealing with this particular topic is also the consequence of disinvestment towards this area and this neighborhood that has taken place in the past years. Probably we took it for granted that nothing bad could happen in that part of Europe for forever. So this led to a disengagement and disinvestments in the human capital needed to analyze and assess what's going on there with the proper people and minds. I will now turn the floor for a quick second round of questions to Mr. Serhii Khannenje. I hope I pronounced it correctly, Counselor at the Lithuanian Permanent Representation to the EU and Delegate of the CoAfric Working Group. I wanted to ask you, what is in the meetings you attend and in the working groups you are active, what are the topics that you, as a representative of a Baltic country, bring to the table to make the Europe-Africa relation and cooperation more tangible, more concrete? I heard this and I love this expression from the first panel that digitalization is an equalizer. How do you bring your successful experience on digital transition in the decision processes and in these key tables to the discussion with your European counterparts? He needs the mic, yes.
Thank you very much. One more time, apologies on behalf of our ambassador. He has left so suddenly because we have this urgent meeting on the Russian mobilization. It seems the conflict going on an escalation way, and now they knew they are thinking how to respond to this new round of escalation we see. Thank you very much for this event. Really, I think it's a very important topic that we are discussing it today. It's of course it's number one question, I would say, in all European couloirs now. We are at war. Who may think, I would say, until 24th of February that we may sit here just half a year from the February and now speak about the war in Europe in nowadays. Not about development, not about progress, green technologies, fintech or digitalization. Or we're speaking about war. It's not the question of how do Africans perceive this, or how do Europeans or NATO or Russians, you know. The main thing is that we're skipping the future. Really, we're losing the future, not only for Europeans, for Africans. We're losing the future for our children, what kind of world we are going to live for them. I think this is matters. Really, it's not the question of pain of Ukrainian people who are suffering very much now in these days, but this is the question of future of all international system. And maybe you have heard now on these days in New York, very fresh discussions how to reform the United Nations system, because the United Nations system was exactly created to avoid such things after World War II, and now we are at war, and all the international system we known until now it's slowly, but it's collapsing. And as the honorable speaker said from Africa, you know, really the voice of Africans, the voice of Eastern Europeans, the voice of other countries, emerging countries, developing countries, should be heard. It's not about the conflict between the West and the East. It's about to be heard. I very much associated with us. And from my point of view, because I am more dealing with practical things, I would say that it's question of opportunities. Of opportunities that we can find ourselves in relation to Africa. We're speaking about losses, but it's also the question of opportunities. You see, for instance, the energy markets. Yes, we now can see the rapprochement between Europe and the African continent, because the African continent is crucial, absolutely crucial in energy terms. On other side, the Europeans can provide Africa with their technologies, with their help, with we are coming to the digital era. Absolutely, our country is focused on that. We are working on digitalization, on green energy, green transformation, and everything. We are mutually dependent. And if I understand that there is a mutual dependence between Europe and Africa, and we cannot change the geopolitics. We are in the same ship. We are sitting, and we cannot change our neighborhood, our mutual dependence. So we can find the ways forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Mr. Tereshko, we know that the reconstruction and restoration of peace, of dignity, of economic development, or human development in Ukraine will take time, and the whole international community will have to play a big role in that. How do you see African, not only countries in terms of, policymakers, but also the private sector, the CSOs, play a role in this? A lot of African countries are dealing with fragility, reconstruction. A lot of them came out of big civil wars. How do you think, and also you could facilitate this dialogue in a perspective of reconstructing the country? What do you think this role could be from the African counterparts?
Yes, good question. Of course, the Ukraine is thinking very attentively about the future reconstruction, despite war is still ongoing. We already have to plan our efforts, and indeed, we will only welcome any contributions, any efforts that any global partner of Ukraine may suggest, including African one. Why not? And it is clear that only EU efforts of reconstruction will be not sufficient, given the scope of the destruction in Ukraine, and global consolidated efforts in this regard is needed. However, at the same time, we also understand that Africa itself still needs support, and as it was already mentioned, Africa was not able to recover from COVID crisis when the new heat of crisis related to the Russian war against Ukraine hit the continent as well. So in this regard, I would rather see the perspective of restoring, reestablishing, and development of what good which Ukraine and Africa used to have and still have, meaning sustainable and extensive economic relations. So which I believe should be mutually beneficial, both for Ukrainian businesses, Ukrainian companies participating in infrastructure projects in Africa. There were many mentioning of digitalization. Ukraine, for a couple of last years, performed itself one of the success stories of digitalization in Europe, and with already significant expertise even for the EU level. We can suggest many solutions, and we can transfer these ideas also to Africa, which it was mentioned in the first panel that digitalization will contribute to fighting corruption, which is also what the case for Ukraine it still is, frankly, and which is definitely is the case for Africa. So we believe that our immediate potential of mutual interest is reestablishing of normal relations, reestablishing normal trade, bringing concluding more contracts between African consumers and Ukrainian suppliers of agricultural products, which Ukraine still has significant potential to provide. So, and from one hand, it will be useful and interesting for African partners. From other hand, it will help Ukraine to get more revenues, not only rely on the external aid, but to allow Ukraine to earn money ourselves, where we can do this in the most efficient way. So my conclusion would be it's just as sooner the war is over, as soon Ukraine restores its full territorial integrity, as soon restores its full capacity and full potential to produce various commodities and to supply them to Africa, the sooner this will bring more stability, both for Ukrainian economic recovery, but also for African further stability as well.
Yeah, thank you so much. And this is absolutely crucial for, as you said, the role that Ukraine plays in terms of food security for several fragile countries. So that has to be absolutely tackled, and there should be no discussion on, unlocking, all these links and trades that were blocked for so many weeks, and will have also midterm repercussions for the continent's stability. Mr. Bellomo, I remember as a TTG we did research on the future of EU development cooperation, and one of the challenges we realized from the interviews was that despite being, the biggest donor player at the global level, the European Union is not perceived as the key or in the top 5 of key donors from a lot of African countries. So you said that the Global Gateway is not just a rebranding of resources, but my question is, what is, and you mentioned that the goal is to make tangible projects on the ground with concrete results. We also listened before to one of the speakers saying that on the infrastructural side, there is not too much maybe done yet by the EU, or at least it's not perceived yet as a big actor. So what do you think are the key tangible areas in which, let's say, on next February, 1 year after the EU summit, you could already deliver some, not, of course, results, but at least some concrete steps that you have taken as EU, and, of course, as a service supporting the other director generals working on thematic areas?
Thank you for this question, which is indeed pertinent and relates both to the most recent crisis, but also to the broader picture. And you refer to the perception in many African countries about the role and the impact, actually, of the European Union. Too often, and of course, we have to be self-critical, first and foremost, in terms of our communication, which for too long has been focusing on the size of our support instead of, let's say, looking at the deliverables and the impact that our support can make on the ground. So if I could dream about a study, like the cost of non-Europe in Africa, I mean, of course, we all measure what we did, of course, but it would be interesting to know what would be Africa today in terms of crisis, in terms of democracy, in terms of economic development, without the engagement of the European Union of the last 50 years, I would say. So I think that would be an interesting starting point. Then, of course, there is a lot that can be done in terms of communication, and that's where the Europe-Africa partnership can play a role, because this partnership is a combination of political dialogue, policy, and financial support. But there is also what we call a people-to-people dialogue, and we really welcome the engagement of non-state actors, civil society, the media. They have a role to play into painting a different picture about the role of the European Union. And again, if I can refer to the before mentioning a couple of concrete deliverables, which I think are extremely interesting, but allow me also again to refer to this battle of narratives on the sanctions, for instance, which is again, in my opinion, the result of perceptions rather than, or really, again, someone who's better than us in terms of circulating or promoting their own ideas. Because whenever I think the Russian propaganda claims, or whoever claims that the food crisis in Africa is the result of European sanction, this is nothing more than a cynical lie. like many others, been circulating over the years. And that's where, all our leaders from European member states and European institutions, was the case last week in New York in the General Assembly, are trying to debunk these narratives and try to explain. We're doing it at the leaders level, but we're also doing it on the ground. I can tell you that we have addressed letters and we are engaging on the ground with our partner countries and asking them, please, and again, concrete examples, not theory, give us a concrete example, because we are ready to address it. If there is any impact from our sanctions, we are ready to try to find a solution. So please let us know whenever you think. To be honest with you, I doubt we have received one single reply to this request. So it means, once again, that against this narrative, there is not really something on the ground. Now, if I would refer to your question about these deliverables, and one that is very much linked to the COVID crisis, vaccine manufacturing. So someone should also not lose sight of the fact that, of course, a number of countries realized, including Senegal, Rwanda, South Africa, and others, Ghana, realized that dependency on pharmaceutical products and vaccine in particular was not sustainable. And we can hardly disagree with this. So I think that then they tried to address this issue. And I think, without, I would prefer others to say so, but I think that this is happening because of the support of the European Union. Of course, there are a number of private companies, BioNTech and others, who are venturing in Africa, and without even one single euro of support from the public sector. They're doing it as private sector. But at the same time, we, and this was mentioned even in a number of statements from African leaders in the General Assembly, they acknowledged the role of the European Union in building the regulatory framework which allows a company like BioNTech or any other to operate in a given country. The creation and support of the Food and Drug Authorities, the WHO maturity level, a number of issues where the equipment of labs, which are not, very, we're talking about very sophisticated, not only in terms of the supply side, but also in terms of training of all the staff to operate these. So this is something which is, in my opinion, a game changer, which is the result of a so-called global gateway. So we can really come with a concrete deliverable already now, without even waiting next year. So this is already a reality on the ground. So I think, and going back to the broader picture, we have some homeworks in terms of public communication, in terms of engaging, in particular with the youth. I think that, if you look at the demographic trends, if you look at the social fabric, I think that we have a lot to do, a lot to engage with the youth. And that's what we're trying to do in many partner countries. And I can tell you that, we are trying to engage, we're trying to move away from these traditional, I would say, narratives about, of course, we all cannot deny responsibilities of the past. But now I think it's time to work together, and in particular to work in the multilateral framework. And that's where I think also the European Union, but also in our partnership with the African Union and African member states, we're trying to highlight the importance of multilateralism. Of course, we can hardly address this global challenging, being COVID, being the impact of the aggression in Ukraine, in isolation. I think this, and it was mentioned earlier this morning, shows how interconnected we are. And as we are interconnected, we can only address these problems in a coordinated, complementary fashion, and in what we think is a multilateral umbrella, with the UN at its core, but of course with all the adjustment, of course. And we are also, again, self-critical about, and we are working towards innovation in a multilateral system, the seat of the African Union at G20. We strongly support it. We want more inclusive multilateralism. And this is where I think we should aim at, instead of trying to divide, let's say, us, and being, let's say, victims, so to speak, or linked to the legacy of the past.
Yeah, thank you so much also for mentioning the issue of health, because I think in a context where, at least in the richest countries, the pandemic seems to be at least under control. We should never forget that in some regions of the world, in Africa especially, this is one of the elements that brought, the frustration for the disparity, the inequality, and I think the European Medicine Authority could also play a big role for the African Medicine Authority, which was stuck for several years, and the pandemic accelerated the creation of the agency. So I think on this particular topic of public goods, the global gateway, the European Union should be more active and more vocal, because they could bring something that Chinese cannot bring on the table. So, and this is actually linked to the values we promote. I will go back to Dr. Hassan Khannenje. My question is, you mentioned very rightfully about the ambiguity on international law, on human rights, on security, the destabilization of the security context in several regions, Sahel, but also Horn of Africa. In a few weeks, there will be an important forum taking place in Tana. What do you think should be the key message that we Europeans, in the attempt to build a more equal and more structural relation and more honest relation with the Africans, should listen to? I will be participating, and it would be interesting as a European to be in an African context where we have to listen to the needs. You mentioned the unconstitutional changes of governance, but there are a lot of topics on which we could and we should listen to in a better way to the African counterparts, because as you said, Africa is ready to cooperate with several actors all over the world. We don't have a patent of privilege for the relations with the continent. So what do you think should be the messages and the lessons we should draw from this important event in a few weeks from now?
Thank you very much. Let me try to respond to that. Yes, soon, of course, there's going to be an engagement. Now, one of the things that I would probably like to speak to directly, it's important to increase, for instance, Ukrainian agencies insofar as the conflict is concerned. I absolutely agree with the speaker who mentioned that the agency of Ukraine has been missing, and that is why also the perception has been that Ukraine is a pawn between the East and the West in terms of the struggle. And I think when you do that, then the narrative of Ukraine itself and the humanity of it actually gets lost in translation. And so that is going to be important. And perhaps that also explains why when President Zelensky gave an address to the African Union, I think only 4 heads of state showed up, and that actually goes to enforce the point I was trying to talk about. This month, the Polish president was visiting the African Union, and it looks like this kind of speech he gave, he was on a listening tour, at least that's how he framed it. If you go through his speech, is the kind of actually speech and ideas, even though, of course, Poland has also much longer history with the continent, that some of those ideas are going to be important in finding a way to communicate to Africans. But fundamentally, there are a number of issues that are plaguing the continent. One, of course, you have the current food crisis. Now, the current food crisis, of course, it will be disingenuous and dishonest to say that it's exclusively has been caused by the conflict. There have been underlying issues when it comes, for instance, to drought and famine, but also climate change, as well as the pandemic that has affected the ability of countries to do farming. But there's no denying that that conflict has contributed, especially on wheat-reliant countries as well as fertilizer-reliant countries. And Kenya comes into question. That's where I am right now. And I come from a farming place. Fertilizer right now is around $70 for 50 bags, for 50 kilos of fertilizer. That is way beyond the ability of an average farmer to actually do farming, especially when you have a couple of acres, to do that. So one thing that's going to be fundamental is, of course, the area of food. Second, there is a refugee problem. Europe in particular has looked at the refugee or migration problem from the continent from a security perspective, security lens. While, of course, right now we are looking at the refugees from Ukraine from a humanitarian lens. And that is very apparent to many Africans who are looking at, at it as if it's double standards. And so if we can have a common humanitarian approach, especially when it comes to the refugee or migration problem, because some of these are actually deserving. They're coming from conflict areas, they're coming from Eritrea, they're coming from Somalia, they're coming from places which you wouldn't even like yourself to live. So how can we have a more humane EU policy, EU-Africa policy when it comes to migration? Thirdly, it's important to discuss some long-term investments that are divorced from the geopolitical competition, especially the desire to respond to the actions of Russia or China when it comes to investment. That if we can be able to together have a discussion on how can we engage the continent more properly in ways that's going to be mutually interested. This is a continent in 2050 is projected that 1 in every 4 people in the world is going to be from the continent. And so how are we honestly going to have a long-term mutual strategy that is actually going to respond to these challenges? And perhaps in the final analysis comment, I would say, in the light, of course, of what is happening, whether it's the COVID, pandemic, vaccines and stuff like that, which many Africans looked at it as an extension of global apartheid. In case those in the West may not, be aware of that, it was perceived largely, especially, during the time of hoarding of vaccines, that this is an extension of global apartheid, and no one really cares so much about us. Even though what is important in the long term is not to rely on pharmaceuticals per se, but to actually assist this continent or at least some key countries that have some capacity to develop local capacity to be able to produce this. And, a final note, I would say this. History is important, and in as much as we may want to dismiss it, and the Polish president and highlighted that a lot actually in his speech, and that is why I'm saying I think he was able to study the continent to be able to understand what to say and how. History is important, and so if we cannot be able to admit but then move on, or acknowledge some of what is coloring the Africa's perceptions, is going to be hard to make progress. And in polite company, people are not exactly going to share with you the truth, in part because there's a different cultural, in terms of communication between the global South and the Africans as well as the global North. A lot of times, sometimes people are not going to say certain things as direct as they want to. And so it may leave you an impression that someone is actually with you when they're actually not. And that is why you find sometimes the words or the actions do not exactly match the words, in part because you have different communication styles. And that is why part of the problem with communication has actually been has to do with the fact that we don't have different communication styles. There's high context culture communication and there's a low context culture communication. Finally, the messaging and the narrative. It's not about the Russian propaganda that is shaping Africa's thinking. That is sometimes actually being a little bit intellectually patronizing to the continent. It's also informed by the realities of recent past, and that is why I'm saying it's not so much that actually Africans support Moscow or Moscow's actions. Absolutely not. In fact, Moscow is such a marginal player when it comes to economics and the opportunities they can be able to provide to the continent. And most Africans know that. But it is the dissatisfaction and disappointment of especially the leading countries in Europe. The Baltics do not have that baggage. And that is why they're actually going by the good link of linking Europe, because they don't come with this history of contradictions. They have the good goals of Europe without the bad ghosts of colonialism and recent history or experience. However, generally, the EU-Africa relations can be improved and made more robust if we can honestly focus on mutual priorities as well as have honest conversations on both the present, the past, as well as the future when it comes to where we want to go.
Yeah, thank you so much. And this issue of the interest and the need to find common interest rather than just focusing on values where double standards could be easily identified from the past history is crucial. Before opening the floor for a quick Q&A, I will go back again to Patryk. And you said something which is crucial also for think tankers, like how to bring the complexity of discourses in a very fast decision-making process or even debate in the academic debate, but also in the broader debate with the public opinion. So, how do you think this, in the dialogue, especially with the institutions, this complexity should be brought forward in these days? I mean, you have also the experience from the ground because you lived in Senegal. How do you think the academia, the research world should work better with the institutions on the ground and in Brussels to bring this richer complexity to the debate? Because otherwise, as you said, narratives will always be, you know, very simple: East, West, NATO, Russia, Europe, Russia, and there is something very much more complex inside. And also, as you said, the experience of new voices from the East, from the Central Eastern Europe, have to play a role. So what would be your suggestion on this?
So I'm probably not the best person to answer this question, simply because I don't work in the policy world, but my general sense is, you know, thinking out loud almost here, is that we do need to be more inclusive. And, you know, I think Dr. Khannenje's remarks, for many people from Europe, from Eastern Europe, they are probably an eye-opener. I'm not sure that these concerns, critiques, are heard on a regular basis in Europe. And so it's very important to hear what African stakeholders have to say about these issues. Of course, you know, if you live in Africa, you hear it. And I do think there is a difference between a diplomat who does hear things that are diplomatically framed, and, for example, someone like myself who is an academic. I have, I think, slightly more frank conversations with my African friends. And, you know, it is definitely true that these concerns that we just heard are not necessarily well known in the policy world. And you know, I do think at the end of the day, it's as simple as being more inclusive. That means when you organize events like this, and, you know, of course here, chapeau to the organizers for doing precisely that, you know, bringing different perspectives to the table. You have to make sure that you do the extra work, that you find somebody who can articulate these concerns. So yeah, I guess from an institutional perspective, that is the core thing that I would emphasize. Yeah, maybe I'll just stop there also because we're running out of time, and maybe there are questions from the audience. Yep.
Thank you so much. We already have one from 2 questions, 3 questions, so we'll have the mic going around first. Yes. Oh, it was simultaneous, but yeah, Vince.
Thanks, Daniele. Thanks, everyone, for the session. Vince Chadwick from DevX. I'm a journalist. My first question to Mr. Tereshko, I'm not sure if you're able to give any more detail about the visit that's coming up in the next few days. I understand if you're not able to give that detail about where, when, and also why, perhaps. What's the aim of this visit? It's in the context of what we've been talking about as well, of your minister to Africa. And to Mr. Bellomo, I wanted to ask about this notion that the EU sanctions have no impact on Africa. It's all Russian propaganda. We're losing the battle of messaging. In the famous, well, famous in some circles, heads of mission letter from Addis over summer, the representatives of the EU member states in the African Union wrote to headquarters and they said it's not enough to keep saying this. It's not working. And so we're in this kind of dialogue du sourd, where Europe keeps saying it's all Russian propaganda, while, if I understand correctly, tweaking some of the sanctions at the margins as well. So I just wanted to really clarify how you see this issue. Is it the case that Europe really is been irreproachable on its approach to sanctions, would do the same thing over again, or is there scope for a little bit of saying mea culpa at the margins without at all buying into, as you say, the Russian propaganda? It seems like Brussels has taken a very absolutist approach and said, well, everything we did was great and it's all Russian propaganda, but the heads of mission in Addis are saying something different. And so I just wanted to clarify how you see that. Thank you.
Thanks. Let's collect the two questions, and then we will go back to the panelist. Yes.
Yes, thank you. I have a quick comment and a question. So I think what we've heard here, that a lot of this is linked to strategic communications. And this has been a topic that Estonia has been already starting a long time ago with the special group in EAS, in the External Action Service, that started towards the east. But I think, unfortunately, like we had for the East Stratcom, we don't have enough resources in that area, and we're also very slow to respond. So, for example, some of the points that were brought up by Hassan about Europe in general. Well, we were, for example, with France in mission in Bakan. Also, we were one of the first to join the EU mission in Central African Republic, which he was mentioning were for the causes from Libya. So, I mean, I think these types of points we don't understand. Even inside the European Union, Patryk brought up some points about Eastern Europeans not being in the picture enough, which some were very valid points. But we've already had an ambassador to Liberia. We just had the Estonian EU ambassador to just finished in South Africa, and we currently have the ambassador to Somalia. And I'm sure that our colleagues in Latvia and Lithuania have the similar coverage. So I mean, we are getting the access. Our Prime Minister Kaja Kallas has been on CNN, BBC. You know, she's out there passing the messages. So yes, it's been a slow in the Stratcom. We're getting there, but we really need more resources, and we need to respond quickly, because I think that's where we're the slowest. The other side gets their messages out before us, and then we're slow to answer. And sorry to be long, but my quick question is that there will be an international court after the war is ended. And for the court to be respected, that means our African friends also have to be supportive of the court process. So how do we, maybe to Hassan and Patryk, how do we convince, or how do we message to our African friends that this court has to take place after the war? Thank you.
Thank you. I have another question.
Thank you to the panel, and my name is Serhii from the Africa-Europe Foundation, so delighted also to be able to host this event and also to promote this kind of dialogue, which is ever more important. From my perspective, it might also reflect a little bit, again, on this whole conversation about narrative, about a dissonance between the way that things are presented or explained, but I think when it comes to the next month, we have COP27, we have the ongoing crisis in Ukraine and the ongoing energy crisis, which is only going to keep on becoming more and more exacerbated in the winter months. And we've seen a clear movement from the European camp, on the one hand, to maintain its position around the European Green Deal, about the kind of national determined commitments that we have for COP. At the same time, continuing to push African nations to leapfrog, to engage with the green transition, to ensure that there is this fast-paced movement to, climate neutrality. But then, of course, Europe looks at itself looking for energy sources in Algeria or with new partners in Africa. So I also wanted to hear the panel's comment about this kind of dissonance and the kind of communications that perhaps aren't hitting the mark, or perhaps there needs to be a little bit more open and honest dialogue when it comes to Europe's needs as well, and what does that entail for Africa's green transition? So very complex, apologies, but even just a comment is sufficient.
Okay, I don't see other questions, so maybe I can ask Nicola and Serhii to respond to the question raised by Vince, the two questions, and then I will ask Patryk and Hassan to respond, and also we can also try to reply to the question of the Green Deal and the implications. I can also ask Salius to intervene on that. So Nicola can start.
Well, very briefly on the sanctions. Thank you for the question, and this allows me also to make another point, that very often we look at these sanctions like these are an European invention, that Europeans are the only one to apply sanctions, because we are fully aware of the the impact and the broader picture. But even at the African Union level, there are a number of instruments and tools, restrictive measures and sanctions already at that level. But that's another story. When it comes to the let's say the impact and the approach, I mean, I can hardly speak about the head of missions in Addis, but I think even HRVP referred only a few days ago to the sanctions as a weight reduction kind of a diet, I think he mentioned, which takes time, can hardly produce. I think considering the sanctions, they are failing. It would be a big mistake if you look at the very short term. We are convinced that these sanctions are really producing effects. And are likely and are part of the support to Ukraine, but we can hardly look at this in the very short term. And again, when it comes to potential spilling effect, spillover to African countries or even to other non-European countries, we are ready to engage. We launched that dialogue, and I can tell you, to the best of my knowledge, we have not received really concrete examples. On the contrary, we can be proud of what we are doing in supporting the Black Sea Grain Initiative, promoting the solidarity lanes, etc., to address issues that are potentially the result of not the sanctions, but of the war in Ukraine. So, and as even HRVP mentioned, and I think the ambassador earlier mentioned, it's worth mentioning that these solidarity lanes and the Black Sea grain, it's serving mainly African countries, not Europeans. As you know, we are not benefiting mainly from these. These products we are able to channel in spite of the war, and some might say in spite of the sanctions, are really reaching those more in need, meaning in African countries.
Yes. I cannot tell you the exact countries and exact dates, but it is going to happen very soon. And the overall idea that these are the countries of mostly sub-Saharan Africa, because we can Ukraine has traditionally still have strong diplomatic presence, more strong diplomatic presence in Northern Africa, and with well-sustained and well-established trade relations, in particular for agricultural goods. So the accent will be on sub-Saharan Central Africa, and which is also more important, despite we have few embassies across Africa, more than our Estonian and Latvian colleagues said in the morning. We have few, but the idea to have the visits to the places where we do not have diplomatic presence, and to establish ties over there or develop ties over there. So, and the idea first, yes, and the communication and is key, as these discussions proves, that we have to convey in fact for us, it's kind of natural things that in fact we are standing for the things which in fact African countries are standing for their sovereign choices, for their right to define their own destiny, and to coordinate our efforts probably on the external arena, because for instance it's sad irony again that African countries are in big majority are shy to follow Western approach on the UN stage. But for instance, it's Ukraine is standing for reform of the United Nations Security Council with many other Western countries, and our president mentioning why the last week at the GA Assembly raised this issue that why African voice is not heard is not well present in the Security Council. Why Central Eastern European voice is not strongly present in the general Security Council level, and it's opposite. Russia is opposing this reform. Russia is willing to preserve this status quo, which is not satisfies neither Ukraine nor Africa. So even at this simple issues we made to talk to each other to coordinate our position. And of course we want to bring more practice into our relations with Africa, to talk about establishing stronger economic relation, linking us closer in terms of economy, trade, and logistics, and of course also to convey messages what efforts Ukraine is doing despite the war, in order to support Africa in terms of agricultural supplies. And for instance, despite war, Ukraine has provided humanitarian assistance to Somalia and Ethiopia, I believe, with grain, so not as a kind of trade, but as a humanitarian assistance. And this is also have to be communicated, and probably it is known on the overall expert level of, but not really felt and known on the ground. So we want to have closer ties with Africa, and the purpose of the visit is here. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll give the floor now to Hassan and then to Patryk for the question on the International Criminal Court. You're muted.
Am I muted?
No, no. It's okay now.
Okay, thank you. Yes. It is true that, for instance, the level of investments and support programs of the country from Europe is far more than what is actually known in public knowledge, either by the citizens of the, on the ground, or even officials in government. And so communication is certainly, one thing that, of course, has to be done. But I think beyond that, I think to speak on two issues that I think are relevant insofar as Africa-EU relations are concerned, is the issue that we just mentioned about the establishment of an international court. To, of course, try what say perhaps those people who violated, human rights, in this conflict. One thing that's important to remember is what the current attitudes of Africans towards international courts, and you have to use the ICC as an example. At the outset, I think ICC had a lot of support from many Africans until they started. There was a growing perception that ICC was an instrument by powerful Western countries to use it against small, poor, especially African countries. And that feeling exactly has not disappeared. We have to be able to find a way of actually changing that narrative. Right now, the feeling is not as prevalent as it was about 5-10 years ago. However, it's still there. One thing that is going to be helpful is to make this organic and have it ownership, whether you want to use it through a General Assembly or just shuttle diplomacy, to be able to have an African buy-in from state to state level, or from using regional blocks and creating justifications, perhaps in form of support of some kind of a tribunal and something like that. Now, one thing that is also going to be important, especially in creation of this, to be able to get African support, is it should not be constructed as a political or geopolitical witch hunt against, for instance, Moscow, because Africans right now are very shy, especially in taking a unilateral, very, what I would say adversarial approach towards Moscow, in part because of what I call the emerging Sino-Russian alliance, in which, of course, China is a big player on the continent. And so, because Africans are also very keenly aware of the kind of vulnerability that may put them into, it's going to be hard if it's framed as a court, for instance, not to try people who committed certain crimes, but let's say, that is targeted towards Moscow, is going to be extremely hard to get an African support. On the climate agenda, Nairobi is the headquarters of the United Nations Environmental Programme. And part of the charter, part of the conversations and the discourse, especially in this part of the world, has been that advanced economies are asking the continent to do too much when they're not exactly prepared to do that, in part because they're still heavily reliant, especially on fossil fuels. They have not developed the capacity in terms of energy independence in green energy to be able to win themselves off that. And so there are certain targets being asked to meet that are just beyond the realm of reality, with especially give context in which they're expected to be met. Especially when there is no funding. The countries on the continent, and especially in the Horn of Africa region, they are suffering the most when it comes to the effects of climate change. However, I don't think there is enough funding, enough money to be able that you come up with programs, including even agriculture, that is going to actually be able to prevent this, not just in terms of energy. And so I think that is something that has to be, looked into with regard to what kind of exceptions or exemptions can we be able to give the continent, and within what time frame, to be able to actually get Africa also to buy into that, because they're the most affected by the current climate crisis that we are facing. Perhaps I think I'll stop at that and put it back to the moderator. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think this is fascinating. I really find these conversations enriching. The point about communications and narratives, I think this is so true. A lot of this boils down to communications. And here I do want to acknowledge that I do think that Eastern Europeans have been more present in the European structures, for example. I think that's a valid point. I actually worked for the External Action Service. I started 13 years ago. And at the time, things were pretty bad. These things have definitely changed. And I also take your point about, for example, Estonian, Eastern European politicians featuring on CNN. So, I mean, the picture is certainly not all bleak. And I did say at the beginning that I am overgeneralizing slightly. I think the point stands, but the picture is certainly not bleak. And I do think there's also a distinction to be made here a little bit between the policy space and the academic space. I do feel that in general, when it comes to the policy space, Eastern European voices have actually been more prominent than I expected at the beginning of this war. I did feel that this would be sort of a case where Eastern Europe's concerns, Ukraine in particular, would be sort of brushed aside. And I do think that there was certainly a risk at the beginning that would happen. But everybody was prepared to sort of, move on. But Ukraine forced Europe to really deal with this issue by defending itself so courageously. But in the academic space, I feel that there's really more scope for improvement in terms of sort of diversifying the discourse. On communications, though, I do want to make one point, and this will tie in with the substantive point about the special tribunal. I think we also have to be realistic about something. And that is that not everything can be agreed upon. I almost get a sense here that if we increase dialogue, if we communicate better, we will find common ground. And of course, that's the goal, right? And that is a hopeful note to end on. But I think realistically, there are certain challenges that will be very difficult to overcome. Certain differences of opinion. Especially I'm thinking here about values, right? Democracy, the role of democracy on the European continent versus the role of democracy on the African continent. And, increasingly, these are going to be difficult conversations. Human rights is another issue, right? Human rights, a very polarizing issue where there are differences of opinion where I don't think there's an easy way to find common ground. Now, moving on to, it's my role as an academic to be a little critical, and so I can't just be positive about communication. But now, moving on to the substantive point about the special court, the special tribunal, and this, I think, will maybe confirm what I just said. I do think it's going to be difficult because I think you asked the question, the ambassador to Estonia, that we need to get people to buy into this special tribunal. I happen to work on international criminal law. This is what I do full time. And I think that this special tribunal is controversial for a variety of reasons that I'm not going to get into right now. I mean, let's be clear. I want to hold Vladimir Putin accountable for the crime of aggression. The special tribunal is a tribunal that is proposed for the crime of aggression specifically. It's not for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. For that, we have the International Criminal Court, which is already in The Hague. and those crimes are being investigated. There's a proposal to set up a separate tribunal for the crime of aggression that would deal specifically with Russian aggression, this case of aggression, one of the first since World War II, one of the most blatant violations of Article 2.4 since World War II. Now, the difficulty is getting everybody to agree that we need another tribunal, that we need to set up a separate court to deal with this single case. And I see the value in this, let's put it this way, as an academic who is observing this discussion. And I know that Eastern European countries are pushing very hard for this. Poland, the Baltic states in particular, Ukraine also. And there is more ambiguity among Western European states, it has to be said, Western European states, and then the third world, the global south. Now, substantively, it's a very complicated conversation. I'm not going to get into the legal parameters of this tribunal because that's not what we're here for, but it's a complicated conversation, especially when it comes to immunities. African states have serious concerns about immunities under international law and how this tribunal would relate to that. But then the other problem that I've noticed, and I'll end on this, is that we have been talking a lot about the special tribunal for people who follow this conversation, international lawyers in particular. And there is this push from certain countries to establish a special tribunal for the crime of aggression. And yet we have heard very little, to be frank, about how this tribunal is supposed to operate. And this is a core question, right? It's really about the institutional design of the tribunal. This has been shrouded in mystery. And so to me, a little bit, I have to say, for the time being, this is almost sort of as a, this is almost sort of like, something that we're trying to sell. Either you're for or against the tribunal, but I don't think that it's as simple as that. We have to actually know what it is that we're buying into, what it is that we're trying to convince people to buy into, and that conversation, unfortunately, has not been had, and until that conversation happens and we see, the blueprint, what are we proposing, and what is it that other states are supposed to support? I don't think this conversation is going to move forward.
Thanks, Patryk. We are running out of time, so we'll have to close the panel. But I would like to thank all the panelists who came here today. I think I learned a lot from this conversation, and I can only say that it's important also for us as think tankers to bring new voices in our internal debate on these issues on EU-Africa relations, and I'm grateful that I had the chance today to learn a lot of interesting insights from you all, digitally or physically. I would also like to thank Africa and Africa Euro Foundation for hosting the event, and now we'll give the floor to you, Khannenje, for the final thoughts, but thanks so much.
I'll be very, very brief because I know we are over time. So just a quick round of thank yous. So first of all, thank you, New Partners Initiative, for sponsoring this, Africa Europe Foundation, Friends of Europe, and especially I want to thank the team of Africa. So it's Lucas, Julia, and Birgit over there. A round of applause, please, for the team. And I also want to thank the other team, Nicolas, Chahaya, if I'm correct, and Alessandra. Thank you so much. A round of applause for them. And thank you so much for all the distinguished speakers. Thank you, Hassan, for joining us digitally. It was a pleasure. And thank you, our colleagues from Estonia and Latvia, for being with us in the morning. And thank you, the audience, for being here, for asking the questions. I'm really happy we had this dialogue and we opened, hopefully, some new ideas and gave some food for thought for everybody. Thank you.